High in the mountains of northern Ethiopia, where the clouds settle low over ancient stone and the air smells of incense and dust, there are monasteries older than most nations, carved into cliffs, hidden in caves, perched on plateaus that seem to touch the sky. These are places where time moves differently. Some of these monasteries have stood since the 4th century, since the earliest days of Christianity in Africa, long before the faith ever reached much of Europe. It was in one such place, a monastery whose name few outsiders have ever heard, that a monk lived out the final decades of his life in near total silence. And it was there, in his final hours, that he said something so unexpected, so unsettling to those who heard it, that for years afterward no one dared repeat it aloud. This is the story of those words, and why they were never meant to reach the outside world. To understand why this moment matters, you have to understand the world this monk came from. Ethiopian Orthodox monasticism is unlike almost anything else in Christian tradition. It traces its roots to the 9 Saints, a group of monks who arrived in the Aksumite kingdom in the 5th century, fleeing theological disputes in the Byzantine world. They settled in the highlands, built monasteries into the rock itself. It began a tradition of asceticism so severe that it has few parallels anywhere else in the Christian world. Monks in this tradition often live in near total isolation. Some spend decades without speaking a word to another human being. Others climb rock pillars hundreds of feet high, using nothing but handholds worn smooth by centuries of use, to reach hermitages where they will spend the rest of their lives in prayer. Food is lowered to them in baskets. Contact with the world below is minimal, sometimes non-existent. The monk at the center of this story, for the sake of this telling, we will call him Abba Johannes, a name common among Ethiopian monastics, chosen here to honor his memory without exposing details that were never meant to be shared, lived in exactly this kind of isolation. By the time he was an old man, he had not left his cliffside dwelling in over 40 years. Few people ever saw his face. Fewer still ever heard his voice. What we know of his early life comes from fragments. Stories passed down among the small community of monks who supported him, brought him what little he needed, and prayed alongside him from a respectful distance. He was said to have come from a family of farmers in the Tigray highlands, and as a young man, he had shown an intensity of devotion that unsettled even his own parents. He would disappear for days into the hills to pray. He fasted far beyond what was expected, even for a devout household. And one day, without warning, he left his village entirely and walked for weeks until he reached the monastery that would become his home for the rest of his life. The monks who received him did not question him. In this tradition, such calling is understood, even expected. He was given a small space to begin his training, and within a few years, he asked for something unusual, permission to live entirely apart, in silence, for the remainder of his life. His superior, an elder monk known for his own decades of solitary prayer, granted the request, but with a warning. Silence like this is not merely the absence of words, he told the young man. It is a confrontation. You will meet yourself in that silence, and eventually you will meet something greater than yourself. Not everyone survives that meeting with their mind intact. The young monk did not flinch. He accepted the warning as a blessing, and he began his ascent, both literal, into the cliffside dwelling that would become his home, and spiritual, into a form of devotion that few could imagine surviving. Decades passed. The world outside changed dramatically. Empires rose and fell. Wars came to Ethiopia and receded. Revolutions swept through the country, replacing one government with another, then another again. Roads were built, radios appeared. Eventually, even the far reaches of the highlands were touched by modernity. Trucks bringing supplies, the occasional traveler with a camera, whispers of a wider world. But in his small stone dwelling, the monk remained untouched by any of it. He did not know the names of the rulers who came and went. He did not know that a war had passed within a few dozen miles of his cliffside home. His days were built entirely around prayer, fasting, the reading of scripture in Ge'ez, the ancient liturgical language of Ethiopian Christianity. And long hours of silence in which, according to those who observed him from a distance, he would sometimes appear to be speaking with someone unseen. The other monks who supported him grew used to this. They did not consider it strange. In their tradition, this kind of experience, visions, voices, encounters that could not be explained by ordinary means, was simply understood as part of what happened to a person who gave themselves so completely to solitude and prayer. It was neither celebrated nor feared. It was simply accepted as part of the path he had chosen. What they did not expect was what would happen at the very end of his life. By the time Abba Johannes reached his final years, he was, by most estimates, well into his 90s. His body had grown frail, but according to those who still brought him food and water, his mind remained remarkably clear. If anything, those close to him said, he seemed more present in his final years than he had been decades earlier, as though whatever process of stripping away that solitude had performed on him had left something purer behind. In the final months of his life, a younger monk was assigned to check on him more frequently, sensing that his time was near. This younger monk, who many years later would share fragments of what happened, though only within the trusted circles of his own monastic community, began to notice something unusual. The old monk had begun speaking more than he had in decades, not to the younger monk directly, but in a kind of murmured continuous prayer, sometimes lasting for hours. Most of it was unintelligible, or at least indistinguishable from ordinary prayer. But near the very end, in his final days, something changed. According to the account passed down through this trusted circle, an account that has never been formally recorded, never published, and shared only in fragments out of deep respect for the sanctity of the moment, the old monk began to speak with unusual clarity in his last hours. His voice, which had been reduced by age and decades of disuse to little more than a whisper, suddenly grew steady. He was not speaking to the younger monk who sat beside him. He appeared to be speaking to someone else entirely, someone only he could see. The younger monk, out of reverence and a sense that he was witnessing something not meant for him, did not attempt to interrupt or question what was happening. He simply stayed present, praying quietly as the old man's words continued. What he heard in fragments was not what he expected. He expected perhaps a final confession, a final plea for mercy. Oh, it's the kind of words one might associate with a man approaching the end of a long life of devotion. What he heard instead was something that sounded less like a man pleading with God, and more like a man in conversation. A dialogue, not a monologue. There were pauses, as though the old monk were listening to a response. There were moments where his expression shifted, surprise, tenderness, even what looked like quiet laughter, though no sound accompanied it. And then, near the very end, the old monk said something that the younger monk would never forget, though he would spend the rest of his life uncertain about how, or whether, it should ever be shared. This is the part of the story that has been passed down carefully in whispers among a small circle of monks who consider it too sacred and perhaps too dangerous in its implications to share widely. The old monk, according to this account, said that he had spent his entire life believing he was seeking Christ, searching for him in scripture, in prayer, in the silence of his cliffside home. But in his final hours, he said he understood that he had never once been searching alone. Christ, he said, had not been a distant figure he was striving to reach. Christ had been present with him the entire time, in every hour of solitude, in every moment of doubt, in every silence that had once felt unbearable. He said, and this is the part that has caused the most quiet unease among those who have heard it, that the vast majority of what is taught about faith, devotion, and the pursuit of God gets one crucial thing backward. We are taught, he said, to seek, to climb, to strive toward a distant holiness, as though God were something to be earned through enough suffering, enough isolation, enough sacrifice. But what he understood in his final moments was that this entire framework, while not wrong exactly, missed something essential. The searching itself was never the point. The relationship was already there, waiting to be noticed from the very beginning. He said that if he had understood this decades earlier, he might have lived his entire life differently. Not through less devotion, but through a devotion built on presence and gratitude rather than distance and striving. And then, according to the account, he said one final thing, spoken so quietly that the younger monk had to lean close to hear it, that this understanding, this simple, almost embarrassingly simple truth, was not meant to be a lesson delivered to the world. It was meant only for him, a gift given at the end of a long and difficult road, and he asked that it be allowed to remain that way. Shortly after, he closed his eyes and did not open them again. Why, then, tell this story at all, if the monk himself asked for these words to remain private? This is the question that has occupied the small community entrusted with this account for years. Some among them have argued that the request should be honored completely, that the words were a private gift between one's soul and its creator, and that repeating them, even in careful, respectful terms, risks turning something sacred into something consumed, discussed, debated, and ultimately diminished by an outside world that was never meant to hold it. Others have argued differently. They point out that Ethiopian monastic tradition, for all its emphasis on silence and hiddenness, has never been entirely closed to the world. Its history, its liturgy, its centuries of accumulated wisdom have survived precisely because, at certain moments, someone chose to share what might otherwise have been lost. They argue that there's a difference between exploiting a sacred moment and honoring it by allowing others, carefully, respectfully, to encounter its meaning. What seems to be agreed upon, even among those who differ on this question, is that the specific details of the old monk's life, his exact words, and the precise nature of what he experienced should remain protected. What can be shared, they believe, is the shape of the story, the reminder it offers to anyone who hears it. That reminder is this: for all our striving, for all our searching, for all the effort we pour into trying to reach something greater than ourselves, it is possible that we have misunderstood the nature of the search itself. It is possible that what we are looking for has never been as distant as we assumed, It is possible that presence, not distance, was always the point. There is something worth sitting with in this story, regardless of one's own beliefs or tradition. The old monk spent nearly his entire adult life in extreme isolation, believing that this isolation was the path towards something distant and difficult to reach. And only at the very end did he come to understand, or so the story tells us, that what he had been striving toward had been present all along. How many of us, in our own ways, are doing something similar, striving toward a version of peace, of meaning, of connection, that we imagine to be far away, achievable only through enough effort, enough success, enough accumulated proof of our own worthiness, when perhaps what we are seeking has been closer than we ever imagined, waiting only to be noticed? This is not a story that asks you to adopt any particular set of beliefs. It is a story that asks you to pause, even briefly, and consider whether you, too, might be spending your energy searching for something that does not need to be found, so much as it needs to be recognized. The monks who protect this account do not offer it as proof of anything. They do not claim it as evidence for any particular theological position. They offer it, when they choose to offer it at all, simply as an invitation. The same invitation, perhaps, that the old monk himself received in his final hours, after a lifetime of searching. An invitation to stop, if only for a moment, and notice what has been present all along. If this story resonated with you, consider sitting with it in silence for a few minutes rather than moving immediately to the next thing. There is something in these old traditions, the deliberate slowness, the deep patience, the willingness to sit with mystery rather than rushing to explain it away, that our modern world has largely lost, and that might be worth reclaiming, even briefly, even imperfectly. Whatever your own tradition or beliefs may you find, in your own way and in your own time, whatever it is you have spent your life searching for. And may you discover, as this old monk did, that it may have been closer than you ever imagined. But Daniel didn't stop. Each failure taught him something specific about how water moved across his particular stretch of land, information no textbook or expert consultation could have given him, because it was unique to the exact contours, soil composition, and rainfall patterns of his farm. He adjusted his designs, experimented with different materials, and slowly, section by section, began to see sections of the fence hold through increasingly severe weather. By the third year, something began to shift, though it was still far too early to call it success. The sections of fence that had survived multiple rainy seasons were visibly changing the land around them. Water that had once rushed straight downhill, carrying topsoil with it, was now pooling gently behind sections of the fence, soaking into the ground instead of running off. Grass and native vegetation, which had struggled to establish itself in the eroded soil for years, began growing more densely in these areas. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't the kind of transformation that would show up in a single dramatic before and after photograph. It was slow, incremental, easy to dismiss if you weren't looking closely. But Daniel was looking closely every single day, and he could see that something was working, even if it was working far more slowly than he had originally hoped. The years that followed were a mixture of steady progress and ongoing setbacks. Severe storms in the 5th year destroyed nearly a quarter of the fence he had built up to that point, forcing him to rebuild sections he thought had been finished. A prolonged drought in the 6th year raised questions about whether the entire project even mattered if there wasn't enough rain to manage in the first place. There were moments, Daniel later admitted, when he seriously considered abandoning the project entirely, not because he had lost faith in the underlying idea, but because the sheer physical and financial toll of 9 years of continuous labor had become difficult to sustain. What kept him going, he has said, wasn't blind optimism. It was the accumulating evidence, season after season, that the sections of fence that held were making a measurable difference, not just in how the land looked, but in actual crop yields on the fields protected by it. By the 8th year, the transformation had become impossible to ignore, even for the fence's harshest critics. The fields protected by the completed sections of the contour fence were producing yields significantly higher than comparable unprotected fields nearby, even during years of below-average rainfall. Soil samples taken from these areas showed measurably higher organic content and moisture retention compared to soil from untreated sections of the property. Word began to spread beyond Daniel's immediate neighbors. Agricultural researchers, who had once dismissed his approach, began requesting visits to study what he had built. Some of the same experts who had told him 9 years earlier that his plan defied basic principles of water management returned to walk the same land and found themselves reconsidering their earlier assessments in light of what they were now seeing with their own eyes. By the end of the 9th year, Daniel had completed the full contour fence system across his property, an intricate network of barriers precisely calibrated to the unique topography of his land, built almost entirely through his own labor, trial, and persistence. The results, once fully measured, were striking. Erosion on his property had been reduced dramatically, groundwater levels beneath his fields had risen measurably compared to surrounding farms, and his overall crop yields had not only stabilized, but had begun to exceed what the land had produced even in its most productive years, decades earlier, before the long decline had begun. What happened next surprised almost everyone, including Daniel himself. Agricultural extension programs in the region began studying his methods formally, documenting the specific techniques he had developed through nearly a decade of hands-on experimentation. Some of the very experts who had originally dismissed the project began incorporating elements of his approach into broader erosion control recommendations for farmers across similar terrain. What had once been considered an eccentric and likely doomed personal project became, within a few years, a case study referenced in discussions about sustainable, low-cost water management for smallholder farms. Neighboring farmers who had watched Daniel's project with skepticism for the better part of a decade began approaching him for advice on their own land. A man who had once been quietly regarded as stubborn, even a little foolish for pouring years of labor into something experts insisted couldn't work, found himself instead being sought out as a source of hard-won, practical knowledge that no formal expert had been able to offer. Perhaps, most remarkably, the broader ecological effects of the fence extended beyond Daniel's own property. As groundwater levels in the immediate area began to stabilize and even rise, some of the benefits started to extend to neighboring farms as well, particularly those downhill from his land. Anu found their own soil gradually improving as the water table beneath the entire area responded to the changes Daniel had spent nearly a decade putting into place. Looking back on the 9 years it took to build something so many people told him was impossible, Daniel has been notably measured in how he talks about the experience. He doesn't describe it as a triumphant story of proving the experts wrong, though there is certainly an element of that in what happened. Instead, he tends to describe it as a long process of listening to the land itself, to the patterns of water and soil that had been trying to tell him something for years before he ever picked up a single fence post. He has said that the biggest lesson from those 9 years wasn't really about fences or erosion or agricultural technique at all. It was about the value of sustained, patient attention to a problem that most people, understandably, don't have the time, resources, or willingness to sit with for as long as it takes to actually understand it. Experts, he has pointed out, weren't necessarily wrong about the general principles they were working from. They simply hadn't spent 9 years walking the same acres of land, watching how water moved across it after every single rainstorm, adjusting their understanding inch by inch until the solution finally, slowly, became clear. There's something worth reflecting on in this story beyond its specific details about fences and farmland. It's a reminder that some of the most meaningful solutions to difficult problems don't come from dramatic breakthroughs or sudden flashes of insight. They come from years of unglamorous, incremental effort, showing up again and again, adjusting course after each failure, refusing to abandon a problem simply because the timeline for solving it is longer than anyone would prefer. Daniel Whitfield's fence still stands today, a quiet, unassuming structure that most outsiders would walk past without giving it a second glance. But to those who understand what it took to build and what it ultimately accomplished, it stands as a reminder that sometimes the things experts say could never work simply haven't been tried by someone willing to spend 9 years finding out.